Hello and welcome. The exit polls are already showing a pretty strong and convincing win for the BJP. Whether that happens or not, we don't know. The election results are going to be on the 16th of May, and that we must wait for that. But there are some issues which are coming up already and which will in some ways point to which way things could go. The question we're asking today, for instance, is will climate change be a central or state issue? While there are two actual points that emerge from this. One, of course, is the issue of climate change and environment. But more than that, how will Modi, as a potential prime minister, handle the issue of federalism versus states? How much power will he hold in the center? How much will he try and drive from the center? And how much will he devolve towards the states if he really wants to achieve some meaningful results, particularly in issues like climate change, or for that matter, energy, or for that matter, lots of other things. I'm joined by Bill Antholis, who heads Brookings Institution from Washington. With me here is Ayaz Memon, and we're going to ask Bill, who's been working on this or looking at this issue for a while, including in his book, India and China, where he interviewed Narendra Modi as Chief Minister of Gujarat. Bill, thank you very much for joining us this morning. So tell us, what's the, you've raised some very pertinent issues in this blog that you wrote, where you talked about, and really you said, is climate change a state or central issue or both? Give us a little bit of background and lay it out for us.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. It's great to be back with you all, and I look forward to coming to India, hopefully before the end of this year. And we've all been watching the elections and looking forward to hearing the outcomes at the end of the week.
Right.
One of the things that inspired me to write this book about federalism in India and what some people refer to as de facto federalism in China is my own experience in the United States, having worked on climate change issues, which has been a one-step up, two-step back process. And one of the reasons for that in the United States is that federalism is both a place, is both an avenue where progressive policies on energy and on climate change have come from the states up, but also our federal system has been one of the things that has held back the United States from taking a national approach. And the European Union has a similar set of stories, so one of the questions that I had going to India and China, among other issues, was on climate. How does it work? How do the states and the central government work together or not work together on these issues? And I found some pretty fascinating answers.
Right, and tell us, when it comes to climate change specifically, and talking about Gujarat now, what are the key factors that are driving what will eventually become the matrix for decision making?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, Gujarat, one of the things that was so interesting to me about Gujarat, setting aside Narendra Modi and his national political ambitions, was that it was one of the first states, first of all, to get to near 100% electrification. And secondly, it's a major point of both importing and refining petrochemical products, and also to some degree exporting, at least to the rest of India, but even beyond, refining oil that comes from elsewhere and moving it. And so because it's such an energy rich state, I was fascinated to know how that happened. What was the combination of central and local action? And it turns out that the Modi administration in Gujarat was really quite successful in power sector reform and pricing issues. But then in digging a little bit deeper, I discovered that Gujarat was the first state to have its own climate change ministry, which was really quite forward-leaning, and that the chief minister took these issues quite seriously, including calling Dr. Pachauri, who heads the Energy Research Institute in New Delhi and is the head of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Scientific Bodies, reaching out to him to get his own set of briefings on the issue. This was really something extraordinary. I had not heard about that from other state leaders in India.
Right, okay. So if we were to pick energy reform, so one of the things that you talked about is, or rather you posed the question in two ways. One is, will he at the central level create more power in some ways by also bringing all these disparate ministries within energy together? And on the other side, will he potentially devolve more power to the states and you know, obviously drive the same agenda? So if you were to look, let's say, I mean, again, you've looked at China, for instance. What's the best way to fix some of these issues, particularly when it comes to energy?
Well, I'm not sure that China's going to be your best model there. In fact,
okay.
Of the four great federal unions, you know, one of my kids like to say about India and China, they were struck at sort of the street level challenges in India, and trash collection in some cities wasn't sort of where they had imagined it would be, but they said, boy, if India in some places was dirty, China's polluted. I mean, the air in China, the actual air pollution is so much worse in so many more cities in China than it is in India. I know recently New Delhi was ranked as having some of the worst air pollution in the world, but it's in our personal experience, it was a whole level of different. And China is the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases and of carbon. It's double the United States almost already. On a per capita basis, it's still smaller than the United States, but it's far beyond India. So let's not look to China on this one, at least not quite yet. They have been doing some progressive things, and it may be a model in the future if some of these things take hold, but it's still in the early stages there. In India, the thing that was so striking to me is that the central government has so many ministries on power. That is, government agencies that directly report to the prime minister. And if you've got 5 or 6 ministries fighting it out with one another for what the policy should be, you're not going to get policy coherence. In most advanced economies, there's usually 1, maybe 2 energy ministries, and then there's also an environmental protection industry. And one can imagine the need for perhaps a third in the mix, depending on how you mix your fuels and whether you go with a very heavy nuclear solution or a renewable solution. One could see adding extra heft to a particular industry, but in India, you've got power, which is both the generation and distribution of power. You've got oil and gas. You've got a coal ministry. You have a renewables ministry, and then you've got nuclear ministry. And it's just so many all fighting for their own place in the pecking order. And as a result, if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. And so my first set of recommendations to any incoming Indian prime minister would be get the central house in order. One of the reasons you have to get the central house in order is you need to give guidance to the states. And states are all over the map, so to speak, on where they stand on energy-related issues, particularly low-carbon energy, and also adapting to climate change. How you deal with droughts, how you deal with a particularly heavy monsoon that might come one year or another. And so it's those set of big challenges that have to be done both at the central and at the local level.
So, Bill, this is Ayaz. Just a quick query. That yes, you've made a study of Gujarat and obviously with China, but where does India stand in the aspect of climate change and renewable energy, conservation of energy, environment in the global kind of matrix? Is there a lot of distance to be covered? Are we moving at all there? Have you done any kind of basic study?
Well, sort of India's place in the world on, if I understand the question correctly, India's place in the world on climate change is that right now, as a country, not counting the European Union as a single country, even though they negotiate as one in the global negotiations, as a country, India is roughly the 4th biggest emitter of greenhouse gases. But of course, in population, it's the 2nd largest country in the world. So on a per capita basis, that is the amount of emissions per person, India actually stands quite low. India, on a per person emissions basis right now, is about where the entire world needs to go in the next 50 years. The challenge, of course, is because India's level of economic development is so low compared to many other countries. India needs to produce a lot more electricity and a lot more other forms of power, cars and trains and airplanes, not to mention local sources of power used directly by everything from farmers to factories. India needs that energy. And right now, the biggest set of sources for energy resources, tend to emit greenhouse gases. So the challenge for India is, if it wants to continue to be a world leader in its per capita emissions, how it does that, how it gets that power without producing a lot of carbon for the atmosphere. And most people project actually that India's carbon footprint will grow, and then before it comes down. And the question is, how high will it grow? And will it put a lot of energy systems in place that emit a lot of carbon that in the next 40 years, once it's installed them, it would have to get rid of? So the key is how to install the most energy efficient and the least carbon emitting sources of energy and power over the next 30 or 40 years, so that by 2050 it doesn't have to put in a whole new set of systems.
Right. Bill, you also talked about, the challenges of bringing and at the federal level to bring, let's say, 6 or 7 disparate ministries, albeit within energy, together. Now, there are corporate interests, vested interests, bureaucratic interests, and all of that. So that's a huge political challenge as well. So might it be then more simple to devolve it in a manner that it's handled more efficiently, or does that mean losing control over something very significant?
Well, there's an American baseball player named Yogi Berra.
Right.
So he Indian gurus, and Yogi had this great expression: when you come to a fork in the road, take it. Which is, you have to do both, right? You have to address the central ministries, partly because they give important guidance to the states. And then you also have to address the state ministries. Now, the challenge with just addressing the state ministries, if you haven't resolved the central ministries, is if you completely devolve things for the states, they could go in any direction. And to some level, that's okay. You want the states to be laboratories of democracy. But they also need some guidance. The challenge for many of the states, as I think Mr. Modi found in Gujarat, was that he had to spend a lot of time getting the states to adopt best practices and to figure out what the best practice was for Gujarat. And he went without a score. He went without any guideposts for how to do that. And he got some things right, and he didn't get some things right. What he got right was the pricing of power. What he didn't get right was how to create a climate change ministry. He tried, and at least by press accounts, I haven't done a deep study of this. In fact, when I saw him 2 years ago, he was just in the process of establishing the ministry. He was making some very important investments and innovations in renewable, solar energy, wind power, hydro. He established a climate change ministry to come up with a state climate action plan. And I gather from the press reports, he has abandoned that. Now, why he abandoned it, I would be really curious to hear. But I'm not surprised when you try to get one of these things going. You don't always succeed in first go-around. In cricket, there are many at-bats, right? There are many innings for different batters to take place. And in this case, it was really just the first inning. And I think each of the states will have to do its own round first on the power and electricity and other forms of energy side, but then on the climate change side to make sure that those investments that you're making are low carbon and don't get you further away from a low carbon pathway that you'll need to do later into the future.
Right. So here's a question, Bill. It says from Shruti. She says, she asks, what are the top 3 challenges facing the new Prime Minister while dealing with climate change, and the top 3 opportunities?
Well, so it's a great question. I think the top 3 challenges are, 1, getting the economy going again. There are a whole bunch of different things that people have laid claim to why the Indian economy hasn't been moving in the last 3 or 4 years. So whoever the next Prime Minister is will need to come in and give a clear set of a clear agenda for economic growth and reform. So that's number 1. Number 2 is getting the pricing of power right. The biggest challenge in the pricing of power has to do with where energy subsidies are applied and where they are not applied. The biggest energy subsidy in India is for rural people who are low income and dependent on agriculture. And unfortunately, too many people were claiming to be rural, low income, and depending on agriculture, when in fact they were not. There were many people out doing agriculture, but were doing it not in a particularly low income way. There are many people that are low income that are urban that frankly don't need that support, because in an urban setting, the price should be, you should be able to, even at a relatively low income basis, should be able to do enough industry to collect, to pay in revenue for the power. And of course, the problem with giving out too much free power is you get what you pay for. If you don't pay for enough power, right, you're not going to get very good power. And so that's the biggest second challenge. And the third, I think, is doing it in a low carbon way. How can we get renewables onto the grid so that they're priced evenly with other fossil fuels that get a lot of subsidies? Remember, coal, even natural gas get significant government subsidies. So how do you make sure that renewables like wind and solar and even hydro are competitive? So those are the 3 biggest, I think, opportunities. I think the biggest challenges in that are, frankly, human capital and government capacity to act. And here I'm not talking about hiring more people in the government. I'm talking about having the right set of people trained in the right ways, and also those who aren't taking bribes to hook up your power or to look the other way if you're not paying for your power. It needs to be clean, it needs to be direct, and it needs to be connected to service delivery. And that's really essential. So that's the number one obstacle, is getting the right set of government actors in the way. Number two is, none of this stuff is cheap. You have to be willing at a political level to not only pay the financial price, but also pay the political cost that will come with energy that at the outset is going to be a little bit more expensive. But I think what Mr. Modi found in Gujarat is people are willing to pay for good quality power. The third challenge, I think, is the bureaucracy and the special interests. There are going to be a lot of people who have a vested interest in keeping things the way that they are, and addressing those vested interests and getting them to work together is a big obstacle.
Right, so here's a question from Shruti. She again asked, given the issues facing an economy like India at this point, do you think climate change would rank high in the government's list of priorities, or how, or rather, where do you think climate change should rank in the government's list of priorities?
Well, it's an easy thing for somebody on the outside to talk about without knowing and feeling the various political pressures that the government will face, particularly on economic growth. I mean, frankly, the cheap way to economic growth is to use cheap, dirty power. The problem with doing that is that it produces both local air pollution, which has long-term health and safety costs for a population, and then the climate change consequences. The consequences of climate change domestically are longer droughts, declining water, and people suffering from heat. I mean, we're all aware outside of India, or many of us are aware, of the thousands of farmer suicides that have happened because the monsoons have not produced as much rain as they need to. So India itself is already feeling directly the effects of climate change. Now, whether any government with a relatively shorter time horizon, like 4 or 5 years in order to get reelected, whether they will feel those pressures and are willing to make the long-term investments needed to address climate change, that's a difficult challenge. Then the last thing I would say is, in the international diplomacy side, India has an opportunity in a new government to step forward and say, we are going to be a leader in the emerging markets for addressing economic growth in an environmentally sustainable way. We don't want to have, like China, 20 or 30 cities where the air is not breathable most days of the year. And that's a real challenge. But it's real too.
Yeah. So, Bill, my question is there an internal challenge in the issue of dissemination of this message? Because the vast majority of people in India would be absolutely unaware of the challenges that the Prime Minister would face, as well as what it means in getting high quality energy, and obviously showing concern about climate change. Do you think that the internal messaging is really as important as anything else?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, you have to get the internal messaging right. In the United States, we've struggled with this for years. Frankly, in Europe, I think European public opinion tends to be rather positive on climate change. One of the reasons for that, I think, is that several European governments took very difficult, painful economic action that brought down their carbon emissions quite dramatically. But they did it before people knew about climate change, and it's always put the European Union in a position to talk about climate change because people don't feel the pain associated with those policies as connected with climate change. They already went through the pain. The United Kingdom shut down its coal mines very famously in the late 1980s under Margaret Thatcher because she said they were inefficient, even though they were also producing a lot of carbon. East Germany shut down its entire coal-based economy when the Berlin Wall fell. Nobody did that because of climate change, but ends up being a huge contribution to Germany's reduced greenhouse gases. And France invested massively in nuclear energy in the late 1980s and early 1990s. 80% of all electricity in France comes from nuclear, which is a non-carbon source. So those three economies, the biggest economies in Europe, went to low carbon, but they didn't do it having to defend it for climate change. So I think sometimes doing these things And arguing that you're doing them on behalf of climate change makes it harder. Now, as somebody who believes in democratic political processes, I'm not saying that that's the way to do it. I think if you're going to sell climate change as a reason for acting, you have to sell the benefits that come from being proactive on climate change. Clean air, potentially less long-lasting droughts, shorter droughts, and a more bountiful, plentiful, rain monsoon season when it comes. There are a range of positive things from acting on climate change, including the intergenerational things, leaving a better world to your children. And given India's enormous capacity for technological innovation, the idea of low energy technology that can be developed at home, I think it's a real possibility for India as an export possibility and something that India should be embracing.
Right, Bill, we've run out of time. I think it's a good, I'd quote from your blog in the last 3 lines that you wrote. You said, on energy and climate change, if Modi is in fact elected, he will face hard choices. It will not only be interesting to see which he chooses, it will be vital. India's growth and the world's climate hang in balance. I think that's a good note to end on. Bill, thank you very much for joining us from Washington, and we'll circle back very soon.
I hope to see you in India.
Absolutely. Look
Lovely.
forward. Thank
Look
you.
Forward, yeah.
Take care. Bye-bye.